Hey everyone, and welcome back to the complete history of World of Warcraft. Today it is time to explore one of the most legendary yet least cleared raids ever introduced, the first Scourge invasion and Drums of War, Vanilla's final patch. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the complete history of Vanilla World of Warcraft. This series is made possible by our patrons who can get the next and final episode right now, plus IRL loot. It's Orc and Shaman month right now, so you'll get all the art, you'll get the sticker, and the Shaman pin, the second in this year's class series. They really do make all of this possible. We thank them for it, and with that, let's go. Naxxramas' opening was heralded by the Scourge invasion. Shipments of infected grain began to appear all across the world, of course, echoing the events of Warcraft 3. Players then would get a debuff that would inevitably kill them, but only to then raise them up as a servant of the Scourge. Now, the severity of this only increased over time as the disease became more and more aggressive to the point where Azeroth was flooded with ghouls. Now, as the plague spread through major cities, floating necropolises would then invade high-level zones of the game. Now, for a time, this basically meant that Azeroth just ground to a halt, only of course until the Argent Dawn worked with both the Horde and the Alliance to find a cure, and then to spur us on, bringing war to the Lich King's right-hand man, Kel'Thuzad. This event, of course, echoed the accidental Blood Plague in many ways, including some players just finding it rather annoying, but unlike the Blood Plague, well, Blizzard had learned. This plague was under their control, and once the invasion was defeated, Azeroth returned to normal and players set their eyes on Naxxramas. Now, raid attunement was of course needed, but this time all the Jaxi needed to do was a simple donation to the Argent Dawn's coffers. They actually couldn't have made that much from it though, as the roadblocks to actually getting to Naxxramas were numerous, making this arguably the most exclusive raid ever in World of Warcraft's history. Vanilla gearing was rather linear. Players would need to be outfitted in gear from AQ 20 and 40 or say Blackwing Lair. Now, to get that, they need to complete Molten Core and Zul'Gurub. They'd then need to do that again and again and again because each 40-player boss would only drop about 3 bits of loot. So if you were starting fresh without an established raiding guild, honestly, catch-up was rather impossible. That's actually not all though, because resistance is massively compounded on this. You see, players had built fire resistance for Molten Core, Shadow for Blackwing Lair, and of course Nature for AQ, but Nax required Frost. Now, luckily, the Argent Dawn sold you Frost resistance patterns, but they would require Frozen runes, and those runes came from Naxxramas. So yes, players would have to progressively clear the raid over a series of lockouts, slowly getting those runes to build up their Frost resistance in order to then make it to the later wings of the raid. Now, you might think that's all a lot, but that's not even it, because they then need a monstrous amount of consumables. Outside of the resistance potions and the buffs that you would need, you'd also need healing potions for fights like Lotheb, as in that fight, healers could only heal once per minute. And believe me, that meant a lot of gold and a lot of grinding. So put this all together, and Nax's most shocking statistic is actually hardly a surprise. Only 100 guilds cleared it before the Burning Crusades pre-patch, and even then, only 35 cleared it after the pre-patch. And that's not the US or the EU number, that's the combined number. This is a hard raid that was even more monstrously hard to get into because it basically required 2 years of progress and a really well-established raiding guild. Naxx itself was split up into a number of quarters. The Arachnid Quarter was considered the easier wing. It had 3 bosses. You had Anubra Khan, the Scarab Lord, who would turn dead opponents into a cloud of biting insects. There was Grand Widow Farilina, whose frenzy would basically cut through tanks in seconds, but would then cool off if one of her ads was actually killed. And then finally, Maxina, who would then root the whole raid for 8 seconds whilst waves of hatchlings flooded into the room. So that was the Arachnid Quarter. Of course, the Construct Quarter's first encounter is one we've all heard of before. Patchwork. He was considered a gear check, with his extremely tight DPS requirements basically sending unprepared guilds back to farming AQ 40. Then you had Grobolus, who would spit out waves of poison and would have to be constantly repositioned, and then, after climbing the sewers of Naxxramas, the raid would have to deal with Gluth, a big canine abomination who would regularly frenzy, inflicting stacking mortal wounds on tanks, forcing tank swaps, a pretty notable mechanic that, of course, we would all get very used to. Then finally, the raid would encounter Thaddeus, so Tesla coils would crackle to life with players being given polarities. Now, if two players of the same polarity stood near each other, their damage output was buffed, which was essential because of the huge health pool that this boss had. Now, the fight actually hosted one more deadly thing, one of the most deadly jumps in vanilla. Yep, going down Thaddeus' platform would regularly take out half the raid if things went wrong. The shortest wing, the Plague Quarter, was no less deadly. Not the Plaguebringer had a mechanic where he would just teleport away from the raid and then summon in increasing waves of undead minions. Now, if raids could not complete this encounter by around the third teleport, then the waves would basically just overwhelm them. There would just be too many. The second encounter featured the rather legendary safety dance, as the raid would then have to memorize and avoid Hygen's floor acid attacks. Of course, 15 years later, during the celebratory time-walking raid, Hygen would once again slaughter droves and droves of players who quite simply couldn't keep up. Then finally, we've got Lothab, whose defining and frustrating debuff meant that healers could only heal once per minute. Yeah, a pretty intense design that put survival squarely on the player's own shoulders, of course, requiring those health potions. Finally, the Death Knight packed military quarter. The first fight, Instructor Resuvius hit like an absolute truck, but if managed well, was one of the easier fights in the raid. We then had Gothic, the Harvester, with his double-sided rune that split the raid between its living and its dead sides, where, upon defeat, living enemies would then turn into spirits on the death side. So basically what happened here is the two sides would have to manage the rate at which they killed adds, such that neither side would be overwhelmed by them. And then finally we've got a legendary fight, perhaps the most iconic of Naxxramas, the Four Horsemen. Now this is widely considered to be one of the hardest pre-TBC fights. These four elite DKs would require 8 tanks, 2 for each horseman. I mean, just imagine how much gearing to get all those players ready. Now, a key mechanic of this fight is that they would place horseman marks. Now, these were dots that would stack every 12 seconds, and basically it was easier to survive a low damage combination of all 4 marks than to have a single horseman's mark actually build up, and this meant that the tank rotation timing was very much key. Now, with the percentage of server populations able to actually enter Nax being so darn small, guilds then began to poach tanks because there was just such a limited supply of tanks that could even do it, so this even caused a lot of drama. And of course, victory here was made even more sweet because it dropped one of the most incredible items ever put into World of Warcraft, the Corrupted Ashbringer, a weapon that to this day remains one of the most legendary weapons. Now, with the 4 wings of Nax cleared, then the portal at the center would activate and players could ascend to the Lich's Quarter. Guarding Kel'Thuzad was the Frostworm Sapphiron, a direct callback to Warcraft 3. Now, Sapphiron was a fairly straightforward fight, but there was a deadly cleave attack to deal with and some fairly tight tuning that did make it tricky enough. But finally, we would have the fallen Kirin wizard Kel'Thuzad, the first lieutenant of the Lich King. Now, his chamber was filled with hordes of skeletons and abominations who would attack the raid in waves. Now, the Lich would then join the fight with his big volleys of frost bolts. You'd eventually get him down to 45% though, and once that happened, he would receive aid from the Lich King, who would send in Scarab Guardians. Now, this essentially put a timer on the fight, as those Guardians would become more and more powerful with each spawn, until they basically just had the power to wipe the raid. But still, manage those, and Kel'Thuzad would finally fall. Now, his phylactery, which of course contains his soul, should have been destroyed there and then, but instead it was taken by Father Ingo Montoy. This was a grave mistake, as years later he would betray us, but of course that's a story for a future expansion. Now, while it was next to bloody impossible to actually get into the place, Naxxramas did have incredibly exciting gear for players. Tier 3 was such a major step up from previous ones, with a full set of it basically trivializing previous raid content, and that eventually did engender a raiding elite who had this incredible gear. Then next, we've got the Great Staff of the Guardian, Atiesh. This has been split into 40 splinters which were held by Kel'Thuzad's minions. Now, once a player had the frame of Atiesh, they could then get a quest from Naxxramas to then get the head and the base. Now, the head was of course held by Kel'Thuzad, which would necessitate another clear of Nax, and then the base was held by Cthulhu, who was of course at this stage still a fairly darn formidable raid boss. Overall, it was an incredible amount of power for such a plain looking fleeting bit of wood. Then finally, of course, the corrupted Ashbringer that we mentioned. Now, unlike Atiesh or Sulfuron, this weapon could be just directly looted after defeating the Four Horsemen raid boss. Now, it was not an item of legendary quality technically, but it did have a rich lore, and better still, that was reflected in-game because when wielding it, players were considered hostile by the Argent Dawn, but on the other hand, the Scarlet Crusade would be considered friendly. Now, what's even better is they tied an event to this. If players walked into Scarlet Monastery, they could see the reckoning between Renault Morgraine, the champion of the Crusade, and of course Alexandros Morgraine, his father. And this is something that Blizzard would then pay off years later in the Death Knight introduction of Wrath of the Lich King. Naxxramas was the final 40-man raid ever. It represented a form of content so exclusive that a vanishingly small percentage of the player base actually got to participate in it. Blizzard were not thrilled by this whatsoever. They thought they put in all of this work into the game and only a tiny percentage of players actually got to experience it. So, with an expansion on the horizon, raids were set to become more accessible with smaller raid sizes and a less linear gear progression, something that would of course have ripple effects years into the future of World of Warcraft. Of course, this patch did add a fair bit past the raid. All new rank 14 PvP weapons were added to the game, rounding out the highly stylized faction-specific gear. We then had the cost to unlearn talents, a pretty long-running sore point for players, now actually slowly decaying over time. Then keyrings were finally added to the game, clearing up some bag space. Consumables were also now put into 3 distinct categories. We had potions, aggressive, and then non-aggressive, and their uses were actually then set to trigger separate cooldowns for their whole category. Then, as with patches that came before, individual classes had major reworks. 1.11 saw both mages and shamans see changes, but notably the shamans weren't particularly thrilled. So mages had utility buffed greatly, Cone of Cold was also buffed, and Arcane Explosion was made instant, something we're used to today. Shamans then received buffs across the board, including longer durations for totems, and then their damage coefficients being changed. Now, these changes were not considered to be thorough enough by much of the shaman community. They felt like their suggestions had largely fallen on deaf ears, and this would all come to a head with the bus shock incident. It's quite a story, and it's something we are going to explore a little bit more in depth in the future, so be sure to subscribe for that one. And really, that's it for patch 1.11. It added Naxxramas, it changed a few things, but it's not the end of this video because it's not the end of vanilla. There is one final patch to cover. Patch 1.12, the Drums of War, was the final patch of vanilla. It released 2 months after Naxxramas, and comparatively speaking, it is one of the smallest patches, and this slowdown was of course all in anticipation of the Burning Crusade. Drums of War was largely something there for the PvP community, and it represented Blizzard's attempt to rein in world PvP a bit. In a move that would echo the later Zones of Outland, Blizzard added objectives to the Eastern Plaguelands and into Silithus, a far cry from the manic state of early world PvP in the game, and something that ended up, well, not really being all that successful, with players just not really bothering that much. Of course, 2018's Battle for Azeroth would pick up the torch from 1.12 with its war mode system and some of its zone objectives. 1.12 also added cross-realm BGs, a move that massively cut down queue times, especially on unbalanced servers. But, yeah, that pretty much is it. So let's talk about the end of vanilla. Through this series, we've charted the entire life of vanilla WoW, a pretty crazy game, much of which was hammered together at the last minute by a studio that was previously known for its real-time strategy games, and in an emerging genre that they pretty much aimed to upend. Were they successful? I mean, yeah, absolutely. Vanilla redefined what an MMO was, and it maintained its throne against waves of WoW killers. A mere 2 months after 1.12 launched, South Park released Make Love, Not Warcraft, further spreading Warcraft's name in an episode that both managed to be critical and celebratory of the MMO trends. And by this stage, WoW had rose up to 6 million subscribers. The next 2 years would see that number pretty much double. And while this is the end of vanilla, it's not the end of us doing this series. Much was left on the cutting room floor. Indeed, Blizzard initially planned an absurd scope, with WoW's title being far more literal. I mean, they basically wanted to include the entire world of Warcraft, Northrend, Outlands, Dragon Isles, all of them. So join us in the next episode where we are going to look into the cut content of vanilla World of Warcraft. So, with that, thank you very much for watching. If you've enjoyed this, please let your friends know. Like, sub, and all that good stuff. And with that, I'll see you next time.